They said I'd never amount to anything after I walked away from the family law firm. Said I threw away a Harvard law degree for some government paperwork job that barely paid the bills. My mother stopped introducing me at country club events. My father removed my nameplate from the office door, without a word, and my younger brother Marcus, he just shook his head and said I'd always been the dreamer, the one who couldn't handle the real world. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But none of them were in that courtroom 3 months ago, when Judge Patricia Henley looked across the room, saw me sitting in the gallery, and her eyes went wide. None of them heard her voice crack when she said those 5 words that changed everything. "You're the Treasury Secretary?" Let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment I stopped being the golden child and started being the family disappointment. My name is Jonathan Mitchell. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, about 20 minutes from downtown Washington. The walls are lined with books on economic policy and international finance, not the leather-bound legal volumes my father expected to see. My coffee table holds reports from the Congressional Budget Office instead of case briefs. And every morning, I wake up to the sound of my neighbor's dog barking, make instant coffee in a mug that says, "World's okayest economist," and remind myself that I made the right choice. Even if my family has never understood it. Growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut, I was supposed to be the heir apparent to Mitchell & Associates, the prestigious law firm my grandfather founded in 1952. Third-generation lawyer, they said. It was practically written in stone. My childhood was filled with talk of billable hours, client acquisitions, and the importance of maintaining the family legacy. While other kids played video games, I was learning to draft contracts. While they went to summer camp, I was interning at the firm, filing documents and watching my father command boardrooms with the kind of authority that made grown men nervous. I was good at it too. Harvard Law School, summa cum laude, a job offer from 3 different white shoe firms before I even graduated. My father's chest puffed with pride when I passed the bar exam on my first try. The golden boy was coming home. For 2 years I played the part perfectly. I wore the tailored suits, worked the 18-hour days, and billed enough hours to make the partners nod approvingly. I was on track for junior partner by 30, full partner by 35. The Mitchell name would continue to grace the letterhead for another generation. But somewhere between my 2nd and 3rd year, during a particularly brutal merger negotiation that kept me in the office for 72 straight hours, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not accomplishment, not even fatigue, just emptiness. I was 28 years old, making more money than most people see in a lifetime, and I felt like I was disappearing 1 billable hour at a time. The breaking point came during a family dinner at the Greenwich Country Club. My father was holding court at our usual table, telling the Pemberton family about my latest victory in corporate litigation. Mrs. Pemberton smiled and said, "Jonathan must be so proud to be carrying on the family tradition." And I opened my mouth to agree, to say the right thing, to play the part one more time. Instead, I said, "Actually, I'm thinking of leaving." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother's smile froze in place. Marcus, who was 26 and fresh out of business school, looked at me like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. "Leaving?" my father said slowly. "Leaving for where?" "I'm not sure yet. Maybe government work, policy analysis, something that actually mattered." My mother laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that cuts. "Government work? Jonathan, you can't be serious. You'd be throwing away everything we've built." "Everything you've built," I corrected quietly. "I never asked for any of this." That was the beginning of the end. Over the next 6 months, every family gathering became a negotiation session. My father would corner me with job offers from competing firms. My mother would casually mention the disappointment in her book club, when she had to explain why her Harvard-educated son was considering public service. Marcus, meanwhile, started positioning himself as the responsible son, the one who understood family obligations. The final straw came when I actually did it. I submitted my resignation letter on a Tuesday morning in March, cleaned out my office, and drove straight to Washington, D.C. I had a small savings account, a letter of recommendation from one of my law school professors, and absolutely no idea what I was doing. My father didn't speak to me for 8 months, but I found something in those early days in Washington that I'd never felt in the mahogany-paneled offices of Greenwich: purpose. I started as a junior policy analyst at the Treasury Department, making about a quarter of what I'd earned at the law firm. My apartment was a studio in a building that smelled like old carpet and Chinese takeout. I took the metro to work every day, squeezed between commuters who looked just as tired as I felt, but somehow I was energized in a way I'd never been before. The work was different. Instead of helping corporations avoid taxes, I was analyzing how tax policy affected working families. Instead of structuring deals to maximize profits for shareholders, I was studying the impact of federal spending on infrastructure and education. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something instead of just maintaining it. My family, however, saw it differently. At Marcus's engagement party that December, I overheard my Aunt Helen talking to my cousin David. "Such a shame about Jonathan," she said, shaking her head. "All that potential, wasted. Sarah tells me he's working for the government now, making practically nothing, and that apartment of his." She trailed off with a disapproving click of her tongue. I was standing right there, holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my monthly Metro pass, wearing a suit I'd bought off the rack at Men's Warehouse instead of having it tailored on Savile Row. For a moment I considered walking over and explaining what I actually did, how policy analysis worked, why it mattered, but then I saw the look on my mother's face, that carefully composed expression that meant she was embarrassed but trying not to show it, and I decided to just stay quiet. That became my default mode at family gatherings: quiet, polite, invisible. I'd show up, make small talk about the weather, and deflect questions about my work with vague responses about government stuff. It was easier than watching their faces when I tried to explain why I cared about marginal tax rates, or the intricacies of federal debt management. Meanwhile, Marcus was thriving. He'd joined a hedge fund, straight out of Wharton, was making serious money, and had just proposed to Caroline Whitmore, whose father owned half of Fairfield County. The engagement party was held at the Whitmore estate, a sprawling Georgian mansion that made our Greenwich house look modest by comparison. Everyone was talking about the wedding, about Marcus's latest promotion, about the bright future ahead for the sensible Mitchell son. I spent most of that party on the terrace, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens, and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Inside I could hear the laughter and conversation of people who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged in the world. And there I was, 31 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, and apparently the family failure. Caroline's father, Judge Robert Whitmore, found me out there around midnight. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that made you straighten your shoulders without thinking about it. He'd been appointed to the federal bench 5 years earlier, and everyone spoke about him with the reverence reserved for someone who'd actually made it to the top. "Jonathan," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Beautiful party, you must be proud." He studied me for a moment. "Marcus tells me you're working in Washington now. Government work." Here it came. The polite dismissal, the gentle suggestion that I might want to reconsider my choices, the well-meaning advice about not wasting my potential. Instead he said, "That's interesting. What kind of government work?" I was so surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice that I actually answered honestly. "Treasury Department. Policy analysis, mostly. I focus on fiscal policy impacts, federal spending efficiency, that sort of thing." "Ah," he said, leaning forward slightly. "So you're one of the people who actually understands how the money works." "I try to be." He nodded slowly. "That's important work, Jonathan. More important than most people realize. The folks who make policy decisions, judges, legislators, executives, we all depend on people like you to tell us what the numbers actually mean." It was the first time in months that someone had talked about my work as if it mattered. I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot of defensive tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Most people don't see it that way, I said. Most people don't understand it, he replied. They think government work is just bureaucracy and red tape. They don't realize that someone has to actually figure out how to make the country work, how to balance budgets, allocate resources, and make sure the whole system doesn't collapse under its own weight. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the estate reflect off the dark windows of the guest house. Finally, he stood up. For what it's worth, he said, I think you made the right choice. Not everyone is cut out for corporate law, and not everyone should. The world needs people who understand the bigger picture. He walked back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being understood. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. That conversation sustained me through the next several years. Through the awkward family dinners where I was introduced as Jonathan, who works for the government. Through the Christmas gatherings where my mother would quickly change the subject when people asked about my career. Through the countless moments when I wondered if I'd thrown away my future for some misguided idealism. But I kept showing up, to family events, to Sunday dinners, to Marcus's wedding 2 years later. I wore my off-the-rack suits, made polite conversation, and maintained the role of the disappointing son who'd never quite lived up to his potential. Because that's what disappointments do. We stay quiet, we stay polite, and we fade into the background while the successful members of the family take center stage. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to ask about, was what I was actually building during those quiet years in Washington. The reports I was writing, the policies I was helping to shape, the slow, methodical work of becoming someone who truly understood how the American economy functioned at its deepest levels. They saw the small apartment, and the government salary, and the absence of a corporate title, and they assumed they knew the whole story. But sometimes the most important work happens in the spaces between what people can see and what they bother to look for. And sometimes, the person everyone has written off is quietly becoming exactly who they were always meant to be. The real breaking point hadn't been the country club dinner or even the resignation letter. It had been 3 weeks earlier, sitting in Conference Room B on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, watching my father destroy a small business owner's life with the casual efficiency of someone swatting a fly. The case was simple enough. A breach of contract dispute between our client, Meridian Industries, and a family-owned manufacturing company in Ohio called Hartwell Components. Tom Hartwell had built his business over 30 years, employing 47 people in a town where good jobs were scarce. When Meridian suddenly changed their contract terms and demanded impossible delivery schedules, Hartwell couldn't comply. So Meridian sued for damages that would bankrupt him. I'd spent weeks preparing the case, diving deep into the contracts, the correspondence, and the delivery records. What I found made my stomach turn. Meridian had deliberately engineered the impossible timeline, knowing Hartwell would fail, so they could break the contract and switch to a cheaper overseas supplier. It was legal, technically, but it was also predatory and cruel. I brought my concerns to my father during our weekly case review. Dad, I think we need to look at this differently. Meridian's behavior here is questionable at best. They're deliberately destroying this family's livelihood. He didn't even look up from his notes. Jonathan, we represent Meridian Industries, not the Hartwell family. Our job is to win this case, not to play social worker. But the ethical implications are irrelevant. Meridian pays us $3 million a year in retainer fees. Tom Hartwell pays us nothing. This isn't complicated. The deposition was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I watched my father systematically dismantle Tom Hartwell, a man in his early 60s with calloused hands and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. For 6 hours, my father questioned him about every detail of his business, every decision he'd made, every corner he'd cut to try to meet Meridian's impossible demands. Mr. Hartwell, my father said in that precise, cutting tone I'd heard 1,000 times, would you agree that your company's failure to meet contractual obligations demonstrates a fundamental inability to operate a reliable business? Tom Hartwell's lawyer, an overworked public defender who was clearly outmatched, objected weakly. Relevance. Your Honor, I'll allow it, said the judge. Hartwell looked across the table at my father, then at me, then back at my father. Mr. Mitchell, I've been running this business since before your son was born. We've never missed a deadline in 30 years until Meridian moved the goalposts. They knew what they were doing. That's not what I asked, Mr. Hartwell. Can you run a reliable business or not? I watched the light die in Tom Hartwell's eyes. He was beaten, and he knew it. We had better lawyers, more resources, and a client who could afford to drag this out for years while his business collapsed around him. I thought I could, he said quietly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Hartwell's hands, the way they'd shaken slightly when he signed document after document that would essentially hand his life's work over to our client. I kept hearing my father's voice, calm and professional, and utterly without mercy. At 3 a.m, I got up and pulled out my laptop. I started researching federal employment statistics for manufacturing jobs in small towns. Then I looked up Hartwell's town specifically, Millfield, Ohio, population 38 and 47. The unemployment rate is already at 12%. If Hartwell Components closed, it wouldn't just affect 47 employees, it would devastate the entire community. I spent the rest of the night reading about economic policy, about how federal trade agreements and tax incentives could either support or undermine businesses like Hartwell's. For the first time in my legal career, I found myself thinking beyond the case, beyond the billable hours, beyond the narrow confines of contract law. The next morning, I asked my father if we could settle. Settle? He looked at me as if I'd suggested we surrender. Jonathan, we're winning. Why would we settle? Because it's the right thing to do. The right thing to do is represent our client's interests. Period. What if our client's interests are wrong? That was when he set down his coffee cup and really looked at me. Son, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. In this business, there is no right and wrong. There are only clients and opposing parties. Winners and losers. If you can't handle that, then maybe corporate law isn't for you. Maybe it isn't. The words were out before I could stop them. My father's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or resignation. I see, he said. Well then, I suppose you have some thinking to do. 3 days later, Tom Hartwell settled for an amount that would keep him out of bankruptcy, but force him to lay off half his workforce. I watched him sign the papers with those same shaking hands, and I knew I couldn't do this anymore. The resignation letter was brief, 2 paragraphs, professional and polite, giving 30 days notice. I didn't mention Tom Hartwell or Meridian Industries, or the sleepless nights. I just said I was pursuing other opportunities. My father read it without comment, then placed it in his desk drawer. Your office will be cleaned out by Friday, he said. Those first months in Washington were brutal. I'd never been poor before, never had to worry about whether I could afford groceries or rent. My studio apartment in DuPont Circle was smaller than my childhood bedroom, with thin walls and a radiator that clanged all night. I learned to shop at discount grocery stores, to take the bus instead of taxis, to make coffee at home instead of buying it from cafes. But I also learned something else, what it felt like to wake up every morning without that sick feeling in my stomach. The Treasury Department was a different world entirely. No mahogany paneling, no leather chairs, no intimidating conference rooms designed to make opposing parties feel small. Just fluorescent lights, government-issued desks, and people who seemed to genuinely care about the work they were doing. My supervisor was a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who'd spent 15 years at the Federal Reserve before moving to Treasury. She was brilliant, direct, and completely unimpressed by my Harvard credentials. Mitchell, she said on my first day, I don't care where you went to school or who your father is. All I care about is whether you can analyze data and write coherent reports. Can you do that? I think so. Good. Here's your first assignment. She handed me a thick folder. Regional Economic Impact Assessment for Proposed Changes to the Earned Income Tax Credit. I need a preliminary analysis by Friday. I'd never done anything like it before. Tax policy wasn't covered in corporate law school, but I dove in, spending late nights learning about marginal tax rates, poverty thresholds, and regional economic multipliers. I interviewed economists, read academic papers, and built spreadsheet models that mapped out how small changes in tax policy would ripple through different communities. When I submitted my report, Dr. Rodriguez read it twice, then looked up at me with something that might have been surprising. "This is good work, Mitchell. Thorough, well-reasoned, and practical." "How long did this take you?" "About 60 hours. Most analysts would have spent 20 and called it done." "Why did you go so deep?" "I thought about Tom Hartwell, about his 47 employees, about the town of Millfield and its 12% unemployment rate. Because the numbers represent real people," I said, "and real people deserve more than 20 hours of analysis." She nodded slowly. "Exactly. Welcome to the team." Over the next year, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including myself. I analyzed the economic impact of federal spending programs, studied the relationship between tax policy and regional development, and learned to translate complex economic data into language that policymakers could actually use. My reports started getting noticed. Not by the media or the public, this was all internal government work, but by senior officials who appreciated thorough analysis and clear thinking. I was invited to briefings, asked to present findings to congressional committees, and gradually given more complex and important assignments. The work was addictive in a way that corporate law had never been. Instead of helping rich clients get richer, I was studying how government policy affected real families, real communities, real lives. Every analysis I wrote had the potential to influence decisions that would impact millions of people. I began to understand something fundamental about how the country actually worked. Laws and regulations weren't abstract concepts, they were tools that could either help or hurt people, depending on how they were designed and implemented. Tax policy could incentivize job creation or drive businesses overseas. Trade agreements could strengthen communities or destroy them. Federal spending could build infrastructure that lasted generations or disappear into bureaucratic waste. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was working on something that mattered. But when I tried to explain this to my family during our monthly dinners, their eyes would glaze over. My mother would nod politely when I mentioned a briefing I'd given to the House Ways and Means Committee, then immediately change the subject to Marcus's latest promotion. My father would grunt noncommittally when I described a policy analysis that had influenced a major spending bill, then ask if I'd given any more thought to returning to real law. They saw the small apartment, the government salary, the absence of prestige, and assumed they understood the whole story. What they didn't see were the late nights spent crafting reports that would shape federal policy for decades. They didn't see the emails from congressional staffers thanking me for analysis that had helped them make better decisions. They didn't see the slow, methodical process of becoming an expert in something that few people understood, but that affected everyone. At family gatherings, I became the son who'd thrown away his potential. The disappointment. The cautionary tale about what happens when you abandon practical ambitions for idealistic notions about public service. And I let them think that, because explaining what I actually did, why it mattered, felt impossible when they'd already decided who I was supposed to be. But late at night, alone in my small apartment, reading economic reports and congressional testimony, I knew I'd found something more valuable than partnership in a prestigious law firm. I'd found work that meant something, work that used every bit of my analytical ability, and legal training in service of something larger than client profits. I just had no idea how much larger it would eventually become. By my 5th year at Treasury, I'd stopped checking my phone during family dinners, not because I was being polite, but because the calls never stopped. Crisis management had become my specialty, though no one at the Mitchell family table knew what that meant. The housing market was showing early signs of instability, nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but patterns in the data that made experienced economists nervous, Mortgage-backed securities were being packaged in ways that reminded those of us who studied the 2008 crisis of a house of cards, built on quicksand. Someone needed to monitor the situation, analyze the risks, and prepare contingency plans. That someone had become me. Dr. Rodriguez had been promoted to Deputy Assistant Secretary 2 years earlier, and she'd brought me with her as Senior Economic Policy Analyst. The title sounded bureaucratic and boring, but the reality was that I'd become one of the handful of people in government who specialized in predicting and preventing economic disasters before they happened. My days started at 5:30 a.m., not because I had to, but because the European markets opened early, and economic crises didn't respect time zones. I'd arrive at the Treasury building while the security guards were still drinking their first coffee, settle into my office on the third floor, and begin the daily ritual of reading overnight reports from Federal Reserve banks, international financial institutions, and economic research centers around the world. The work was intricate, like assembling a massive puzzle where each piece was a data point, and the finished picture showed whether the American economy was stable or heading for trouble. I tracked everything: employment statistics, inflation indicators, currency fluctuations, credit default rates, international trade flows, and dozens of other economic metrics that most people had never heard of, but that determined whether they could get a mortgage, keep their job, or afford to send their kids to college. What made the work challenging was that economic trends moved slowly, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. By the time problems became obvious enough for politicians and journalists to notice, it was usually too late to prevent serious damage. My job was to spot the cracks in the foundation before the building started to collapse. The housing situation was a perfect example. The data showed that mortgage lending standards had loosened significantly over the past 18 months. Banks were approving loans for people who couldn't really afford them, then immediately selling those loans to investment firms who packaged them into complex financial instruments that obscured the underlying risk. It was the same pattern that had led to the 2008 financial crisis, just with different players and slightly different mechanisms. I spent 3 months building a comprehensive analysis of the emerging risks, complete with stress test scenarios and policy recommendations for preventing a full-scale crisis. The report was 127 pages long, dense with statistical analysis and economic modeling, but the executive summary was clear. Without intervention, the housing market could destabilize within 2 years, potentially triggering a recession that would cost millions of Americans their homes and jobs. I submitted the report to Treasury Secretary William Harrison on a Tuesday morning in October. He was a career public servant who'd served under 3 different presidents, someone who understood that boring technical analysis often prevented spectacular disasters. "Mitchell," he said after reading my executive summary, "how confident are you in these projections?" 78%, I replied. "There are too many variables to be more precise, but the underlying trends are clear and consistent." He studied me for a moment. "And your recommendations?" "Immediate regulatory oversight of mortgage-backed securities markets, new capital requirements for banks engaged in subprime lending, enhanced transparency requirements for financial instruments tied to real estate markets, and a coordinated response plan with the Federal Reserve in case the situation deteriorates faster than projected." That's going to be politically challenging. The banking lobby won't like it, and Congress is focused on the midterm elections. "Yes, sir, but the political challenges of prevention are minor compared to the political challenges of cleanup." He nodded slowly. "Draft a briefing memo for the president. Keep it to 2 pages, non-technical language. If we're going to do this, we need the White House on board." That briefing memo became the foundation for what the media would later call the Harrison Doctrine, a series of proactive financial regulations that prevented the housing market instability from spreading to the broader economy. The regulations were implemented quietly, with minimal fanfare, and they worked exactly as designed. The housing market experienced a controlled cooling rather than a catastrophic collapse. Millions of families kept their homes. The broader economy remained stable, but because the crisis never happened, nobody noticed. Prevention doesn't make headlines. The absence of disaster isn't news. My analysis, which had helped prevent massive economic suffering, disappeared into the government archives, classified and forgotten. Meanwhile, at my nephew's birthday party that December, my brother Marcus cornered me near the dessert table. "Jonathan, can I ask you something? What exactly do you do all day at the Treasury? I mean, I know you work for the government, but what's your actual job?" I looked at him, successful hedge fund manager, master of the universe, and tried to figure out how to explain that I'd just helped prevent an economic crisis that could have wiped out half of his portfolio. "I analyze economic data," I said finally. "Policy stuff. Pretty boring." He nodded with the kind of patronizing sympathy reserved for people who'd settled for safe, unambitious careers. "Well, job security is important too. Can't all be risk takers." If only he knew. The prevention work was just one part of what had become an increasingly complex portfolio. I was also involved in international economic negotiations, working with finance ministers and central bank governors from countries around the world. When Greece's debt crisis threatened to destabilize the European Union, I was part of the team that designed the financial mechanisms to contain the damage. When China's currency manipulation was affecting American manufacturing, I helped craft the economic analysis that led to new trade agreements. None of this work was visible to the public. Economic diplomacy happened in conference rooms and private meetings, not on television or in newspaper headlines. But it was essential work that affected millions of people's lives in ways they'd never know about. I remember one particularly intense week when Brazil's central bank was considering a currency devaluation that would have triggered competitive devaluations across Latin America, potentially destabilizing trade relationships throughout the hemisphere. I spent 4 days on conference calls with officials from a dozen countries, working through the economic modeling and negotiating compromise positions that would allow Brazil to address its domestic economic pressures without triggering a regional crisis. The solution we developed was elegant in its simplicity: a coordinated series of trade incentives and currency swap agreements that gave Brazil the flexibility it needed while maintaining regional stability. The entire crisis was resolved without a single news story being written about it. But at Sunday dinner the following week, when my aunt asked what I'd been up to, I just said, "The usual, government stuff." Because, how do you explain that you just helped prevent an international economic crisis that could have affected trade relationships for decades? How do you describe the intricacies of currency policy to people who think government work is filing paperwork and waiting for retirement? The disconnect between my actual responsibilities and my family's perception of my career became almost surreal. By my 7th year at Treasury, I was regularly briefing congressional committees, advising cabinet secretaries, and participating in international economic summits. My analysis was influencing federal policy decisions that affected hundreds of millions of people. But to my family, I was still the disappointment who'd walked away from a promising law career to become a glorified accountant. The irony was particularly sharp when Marcus would describe his work at family gatherings. He managed investment portfolios, he'd explain, helping wealthy clients maximize their returns through sophisticated financial strategies. Everyone would nod appreciatively, impressed by his expertise in navigating complex markets. What he didn't realize was that those markets he navigated so skillfully were stable precisely because of the regulatory frameworks and international agreements that I helped design and implement. His success was built on a foundation of economic policy that he couldn't see and didn't understand. I began to think of my work as being like the electrical system in a building: essential, complex, and completely invisible until something went wrong. Nobody notices the wiring until the lights go out. Nobody appreciates the economic policy apparatus until the economy collapses. During my 8th year, I was asked to lead a comprehensive review of federal debt management strategies. The national debt had been growing steadily for decades, and there were legitimate concerns about long-term fiscal sustainability. Congress wanted an independent analysis of the situation, including recommendations for maintaining economic stability while addressing the structural deficit. It was the kind of assignment that could make or break a career. Get it right, and you'd have influence over federal fiscal policy for years to come. Get it wrong, and you'd be blamed for whatever economic problems emerged from your recommendations. I spent 6 months on the analysis, working with teams of economists, budget specialists, and policy experts. We modeled dozens of different scenarios, from modest adjustments to current spending patterns to dramatic restructuring of federal priorities. The final report was 340 pages of detailed analysis. But the core finding was straightforward. The debt situation was manageable with careful policy adjustments, but only if those adjustments were implemented gradually and systematically over a 10-year period. The recommendations we developed became the foundation for the next decade of federal fiscal policy. Spending priorities were adjusted, tax policies were refined, and debt management strategies were modernized. The changes were implemented so gradually that most people never noticed them, but the cumulative effect was to put the federal government on a sustainable fiscal path for the first time in decades. When the analysis was complete, Treasury Secretary Harrison called me into his office. "Mitchell, this is exceptional work. The kind of comprehensive policy analysis that comes along maybe once in a career. You should be proud." I was proud, but it was a quiet pride, the satisfaction of work done well in service of something larger than myself. There would be no news stories about the debt management review, no public recognition of the team that had designed a solution to one of the country's most pressing long-term challenges. That evening, I called my mother to let her know I'd be late for Sunday dinner. "Working again?" she asked with a sigh. "Jonathan, you need to find some balance in your life. All this government work, it's not healthy." I looked out my office window at the Washington Monument, illuminated against the dark sky, and smiled. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Mom." But I didn't tell her why. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, just as I was reviewing preliminary data on emerging cryptocurrency risks. Secretary Harrison's voice was measured, but I could hear the weight behind his words. "Jonathan, I need you in the Oval Office at 2 o'clock. The President wants to discuss your recommendation on the European banking situation." I set down my coffee cup and tried to process what he'd just said. The Oval Office. After 10 years in government, I'd briefed cabinet members, advised congressional committees, and participated in international negotiations, but I'd never been in the same room as the President of the United States. "Sir, should I prepare additional materials beyond what's in the briefing book?" "No. Just bring yourself and be ready to explain complex financial mechanisms in simple terms." The President appreciates directness. 3 hours later, I was walking through the West Wing, following a Secret Service agent down hallways I'd only seen in movies. The weight of the moment should have been overwhelming, but instead I felt something unexpected: calm confidence. This was what I'd been preparing for my entire career, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. President Elizabeth Morrison was smaller in person than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the room completely. She was known for her sharp intellect and direct communication style, a former federal prosecutor who'd built her political career on competence rather than charisma. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, standing up from behind the resolute desk. "Bill tells me you're the person who understands how European banks might drag our economy down with them. Explain it to me like I'm not an economist." Because I'm not. For the next 20 minutes I walked her through the analysis I'd been developing for months. European banks were heavily exposed to debt from several Eastern European countries whose economies were more fragile than their governments wanted to admit. If those countries defaulted on their obligations, which my modeling suggested was increasingly likely, it could trigger a cascade of bank failures that would spread to American financial institutions through interconnected lending relationships. "So what you're telling me," the President said when I finished, "is that we could have another 2008-style crisis, but this time it starts in Prague and Budapest instead of Wall Street." "That's an accurate summary, Madam President. The mechanisms are different, but the potential impact is similar. And your recommended response?" I outlined the three-part strategy I developed: immediate coordination with European central banks to strengthen oversight of at-risk institutions, expansion of existing currency swap agreements to provide emergency liquidity if needed, and quiet diplomatic pressure on Eastern European governments to implement fiscal reforms before their debt situations became unsustainable. President Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she understood the implications of what I was proposing. When I finished, she was quiet for several moments. "This is preventive medicine," she said finally. "We're going to spend political capital and diplomatic resources to prevent a crisis that may never happen." "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what we're doing. And if we do nothing, then we'll spend considerably more political capital and economic resources dealing with a crisis that definitely will happen." She smiled, the first time her expression had softened since I'd entered the room. "Bill was right about you. You understand that prevention is always cheaper than cleanup." 2 weeks later, the president announced a new international financial stability initiative during a joint press conference with the leaders of Germany and France. The media coverage was minimal. International banking cooperation doesn't generate dramatic headlines, but the substance was exactly what I'd recommended in the Oval Office. Over the following months, the initiative worked precisely as designed. Eastern European countries implemented fiscal reforms in exchange for expanded trade agreements. European banks strengthened their capital reserves through coordinated central bank policies, and the potential crisis that could have triggered a global recession simply didn't happen. But the real significance of that Oval Office meeting wasn't the policy outcome, it was what President Morrison said to Secretary Harrison as I was leaving. "Bill, I want Mitchell to start participating in our weekly economic briefings, and I want him included in the next round of senior staff considerations." Senior staff considerations. I'd been in government long enough to know what that meant. I was being evaluated for appointment to a position that required Senate confirmation, a position that would put me in the highest levels of federal economic policymaking. The irony of this development became clear 3 days later when I attended my nephew Tommy's 7th birthday party at Marcus and Caroline's house in Westchester. The celebration was elaborate, a bounce house, a magician, and catering that probably cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month. I sat at a picnic table with my parents, watching my brother orchestrate the festivities with the same precision he brought to managing investment portfolios. "Jonathan's here," Caroline called out when she spotted me near the gift table. "How lovely. We were just talking about you." She approached Judge Robert Whitmore, her father, who I hadn't seen since Marcus's wedding 3 years earlier. He looked older, but still carried himself with the quiet authority that had impressed me at that engagement party long ago. "Jonathan," the judge said, extending his hand. "Good to see you again. Caroline tells me you're still working at the Treasury?" "Yes, sir. Still there." "Excellent. Important work, even if most people don't appreciate it." He paused, studying my face. "You know, I've been following some of the international banking initiatives coming out of the administration, impressive coordination with European partners." Someone in the Treasury clearly understands how interconnected the global financial system has become. I felt that familiar stirring of being seen, of having someone recognize the significance of work that usually remained invisible. "It's a complex landscape," I said carefully. "Indeed. The prevention work is particularly sophisticated. Someone's doing careful analysis of systemic risks and designing elegant policy solutions." I wish more government work was that thoughtful. Before I could respond, Marcus appeared at my elbow carrying a beer and wearing the satisfied expression of a successful host. "Dad's talking shop again," he said to Judge Whitmore with an affectionate grin. "Hope he's not boring you with legal stuff, Jonathan." "Actually," Judge Whitmore replied, "we were discussing economic policy. Your brother and I were just agreeing that the current administration's approach to international financial stability is quite impressive." Marcus looked puzzled. "Jonathan would know more about government work than I would. I stick to private sector finance, much more straightforward than all that regulatory stuff." The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. Marcus, who managed hundreds of millions of dollars for wealthy clients, dismissing regulatory frameworks as unnecessarily complex. Judge Whitmore, who understood exactly how sophisticated those frameworks were, had no idea that the person who'd helped design them was standing right in front of him. "The regulatory stuff, as you call it," Judge Whitmore said mildly, "is what keeps your private sector finance from collapsing into chaos." Someone has to maintain the guardrails. I suppose, Marcus said with a shrug. But it's not exactly exciting work, is it? I mean, Jonathan's smart enough, but he always preferred the safe route. Government job, steady paycheck, nothing too risky. I watched Judge Whitmore's expression shift slightly, a flicker of something that might have been surprising or disappointing. He glanced at me, then back at Marcus. Safe route, he repeated slowly. Yes, I can see how someone might view it that way. The conversation moved on to other topics. Tommy's school, Caroline's volunteer work, Marcus's latest promotion to senior partner at his firm. I listened with half my attention while the other half processed what had just happened. Judge Whitmore had been impressed by economic policies that I'd helped create, but he had no way of connecting those policies to the unambitious government worker that Marcus had just described. In his mind, Jonathan Mitchell was Marcus's well-meaning but unsuccessful brother, someone who'd chosen security over achievement. But something in the judge's expression suggested he was beginning to sense a disconnect between Marcus's description and his own knowledge of how sophisticated economic policy actually was. Later that evening, as the party was winding down, Judge Whitmore found me again near the dessert table. "Jonathan, can I ask you something? What's your specific role at the Treasury?" "Senior Economic Policy Analyst," I said. "I focus on systemic risk assessment and international financial coordination." He was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Systemic risk assessment," he repeated. "That would include things like monitoring interconnected banking relationships, analyzing potential cascade effects from foreign debt crises, developing preventive policy responses, among other things." "Yes." "And you report to whom?" "Deputy Assistant Secretary Rodriguez." "Sometimes directly to Secretary Harrison, depending on the issue." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, and I could see him recalibrating his understanding of who I was and what I did. "The European Banking Initiative," he said quietly. "The one I mentioned earlier. You were involved in developing that?" "I was." "How involved?" I met his eyes directly. I briefed the president on the risks and recommended the policy response. The judge stared at me for several long moments, his expression moving through surprise, recognition, and what might have been respect. "I see," he said finally. "Well, that's quite different from what I understood." Across the yard, Marcus was laughing with a group of his hedge fund colleagues, probably telling stories about market volatility and investment strategies. He had no idea that the economic stability he took for granted was maintained by policies that his disappointing older brother had helped design. Judge Whitmore followed my gaze. "Does your family know what you actually do?" "They know I work for the government, but not the specifics. They've never asked." He was quiet for a moment, watching Marcus gesture animatedly to his friends. "Sometimes," Judge Whitmore said thoughtfully, "the most important work happens in places where people aren't looking." 2 months later, I received a call that would change everything. President Morrison wanted to nominate me for a position that would require Senate confirmation, a role that would put my name in newspapers and my face on television. The quiet, invisible career I'd built was about to become very public indeed, and my family was about to learn exactly who Jonathan Mitchell had become during all those years they'd stopped paying attention. The phone call from the White House personnel office came on a Tuesday morning in June. I was in my office reviewing quarterly employment statistics when my assistant knocked on the door with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between excitement and panic. "Mr. Mitchell, you have a call from Angela Chen at the White House. She says it's regarding a presidential appointment." I took the call standing by my window, looking out at the Potomac River while Angela Chen explained that President Morrison wanted to nominate me for Treasury Secretary. Secretary Harrison was stepping down to spend time with his ailing wife, and the president needed someone who could handle the position's complex demands without a lengthy learning curve. "The announcement will be made Thursday afternoon," Chen said. "We'll need you at the White House for press briefings starting tomorrow, and Senate confirmation hearings will begin in approximately 3 weeks. Treasury Secretary, the third most powerful position in the federal government, responsible for economic policy that affected every American, I'd spent my entire career working toward moments like this without ever imagining they were possible. But my first thought wasn't about honor or responsibility. It was about my family, and how they were about to discover that their disappointing son had just been nominated for a cabinet-level position. The official announcement was scheduled for Thursday, but Marcus called me Wednesday evening. "Jonathan, I just got the strangest call from Dad. He said someone from the Washington Post contacted the law firm asking about you. Something about a Treasury Department appointment. Do you know what that's about?" I closed my eyes. The media had gotten ahead of the official announcement, which meant I had about 12 hours before my family learned the truth from news reports rather than from me. "Marcus, we should probably talk. Is everyone free for dinner tomorrow night?" "Sure, but what's this about?" Dad sounded confused. "He told the reporter that you work in some kind of analyst role, but they seemed to think you were being considered for something much bigger." "I'll explain everything tomorrow." "Jonathan, you're making me nervous. What exactly haven't you told us?" "Everything," I said quietly. "I haven't told you everything." Thursday morning, I stood beside President Morrison in the Rose Garden as she announced my nomination. The assembled reporters asked predictable questions about my qualifications, my policy priorities, and my vision for the Treasury's role in the administration. I answered with the careful precision that had served me well in congressional briefings, but part of my mind was elsewhere, wondering what my family was thinking as they watched this unfold on television. The president's endorsement was unequivocal. "Jonathan Mitchell has spent the last decade quietly becoming one of our nation's foremost experts on economic policy and international finance. His analysis has prevented multiple financial crises. His recommendations have strengthened our economic relationships with allies around the world, and his judgment has been invaluable to this administration. There is no one more qualified to serve as Treasury Secretary." After the announcement, I had 3 hours of follow-up interviews with financial reporters before I could escape to prepare for dinner with my family. I'd chosen a restaurant in Georgetown, neutral territory, where we could have a private conversation without the emotional weight of the family home. They were already seated when I arrived, my parents, Marcus, Caroline, and Judge Whitmore, who'd apparently been invited as family. The table was quiet in a way that suggested they'd been discussing me before I walked in. My father stood when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "Treasury Secretary," he said, and I couldn't tell if it was a greeting or an accusation. "Not yet," I replied. "The Senate still has to confirm me." "Sit down, son," my mother said, her voice strained. "We have questions." I took the empty chair between Caroline and Judge Whitmore, feeling like I was about to be cross-examined by a particularly challenging jury. "Jonathan," my father began. "We watched the announcement. We heard what the president said about your work, about preventing financial crises, and international coordination. But we don't understand how any of this is possible. You've been working as an analyst. You live in a small apartment. You drive a 10-year-old car. You've never mentioned anything about briefing presidents or influencing policy. Because you never asked," I said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been recognition. "Wait," he said slowly. "The European banking thing that Judge Whitmore mentioned at Tommy's party. The initiative that prevented the Eastern European debt crisis. You were involved in that?" "I designed it." Caroline's hand went to her mouth. "Designed it? What does that mean, exactly?" I looked around the table at these people who'd known me my entire life, but had never bothered to understand what I actually did with my days. "It means I identified the systemic risks, developed the analysis showing how European bank failures could trigger a global recession, and recommended the specific policy responses that prevented it from happening. I briefed the president in the Oval Office, and she implemented my recommendations." Judge Whitmore was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The housing market analysis from 5 years ago. The regulatory changes that prevented the subprime lending crisis from spreading. That was you too?" "Yes. International currency coordination when Brazil was considering devaluation." "Yes. The federal debt management review that restructured our fiscal policy framework." "I led the team," My mother's voice was barely a whisper. How long have you been doing this kind of work? 10 years. About 2 years after I left the law firm. Marcus sat back in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. 10 years? You've been, what? Running economic policy for the federal government for 10 years. And you never mentioned it. I tried to mention it. At dinners, at family gatherings. But every time I started to explain what I was working on, you'd change the subject or make jokes about government bureaucracy. So I stopped trying. The waiter approached to take our order, but my father waved him away without looking up. Jonathan, he said, his lawyer's voice carefully controlled. Help me understand this. You're telling us that while we thought you were filing paperwork and attending meetings, you were actually, what? Advising presidents? Preventing economic disasters? Among other things, yes. And the small apartment, the old car, the modest lifestyle? I like my apartment. I don't need a fancy car, and I've been saving most of my salary because I didn't have expensive tastes or a family to support. Caroline was shaking her head slowly. But Jonathan, we had no idea. When people asked about you, we said you worked for the government in some kind of research role. We told them you'd chosen stability over ambition. I chose service over profit, I corrected. There's a difference. Judge Whitmore finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. Marcus, do you remember what you said at Tommy's party? About your brother preferring the safe route? Marcus winced. Yes. The policies we were discussing. The international financial stability initiatives that I said were so impressive. Your brother didn't just implement them. He conceived them, analyzed them, and convinced the President of the United States to adopt them. There's nothing safe about taking responsibility for preventing global economic crises. The weight of this revelation settled over the table like fog. My parents exchanged glances that contained years of missed conversations and misunderstandings. Marcus stared at his hands, apparently reassessing a decade's worth of family dynamics. Why didn't you tell us? My mother asked, and for the first time I heard genuine hurt in her voice, rather than disappointment. Because you'd already decided who I was, I said. The son who'd failed to live up to his potential. The one who'd chosen a government job because he couldn't handle the pressure of real success. Every time I tried to explain what I was actually doing, you'd dismiss it as government stuff or policy work, and change the subject. After a while, I realized you weren't really interested in understanding. But the Treasury Secretary, my father said, still struggling to process it. That's one of the most important positions in government, the third most powerful, actually, after the president and vice president. And you're qualified for this. I mean, obviously you're qualified or you wouldn't have been nominated. Judge Whitmore interrupted. Bill, your son has been functionally serving as a shadow Treasury Secretary for years. The current secretary has been relying on his analysis for every major economic decision. This nomination isn't a promotion, it's recognition of work he's already been doing. Marcus looked up from his hands. All those times I talked about managing portfolios and navigating market volatility, you were managing the entire American economy. I was part of a team managing the American economy, I corrected, and the global economy, to some extent. Jesus, Marcus whispered. I've been such an ass. The conversation continued for another hour, with more questions, more revelations, more recalibrations of family history. My parents struggled to reconcile the modest government worker they'd pitied with the senior economic policymaker who'd just been nominated for a cabinet position. Marcus kept apologizing for years of condescending comments. Caroline asked detailed questions about what the Treasury Secretary actually did. But it was Judge Whitmore who provided the moment of clarity that cut through all the confusion and shock. Jonathan, he said as we were preparing to leave, I owe you an apology. When I praised those economic policies at Tommy's party, I had no idea I was talking to their architect. I'd assumed you were exactly what your family described, a well-meaning but unambitious government worker. I should have looked more carefully. You looked carefully enough, I replied. You were the only person who ever suggested that economic policy work might be more important than it appeared. He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Your family loves you, but they never bothered to see you. That's their loss, but it's also their opportunity. Starting now. As we walked out of the restaurant, my father caught up with me on the sidewalk. Son, he said, I don't know how to apologize for 10 years of not paying attention. You don't have to apologize, Dad, but maybe you could start asking questions. He nodded, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Treasury Secretary, my God, Jonathan. Treasury Secretary, not yet, I reminded him. The Senate still has to confirm me. They will, Judge Whitmore said, joining us on the sidewalk. I know several of the senators on the banking committee. After what I learned tonight, I'll be making some calls. And for the first time in a decade, I felt like my family might finally be ready to understand who I'd become while they weren't looking. The confirmation hearings were scheduled to begin on a Monday, which gave me exactly 10 days to prepare for the most intensive scrutiny of my professional life. But the weekend before, something unprecedented happened. My family called an emergency gathering. Not for a birthday or holiday, but specifically to discuss me. My mother's voice on the phone was different, smaller somehow, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before.
Jonathan, we've been talking, your father and we realize we need to understand what we missed. All of it. Would you come to dinner Sunday and help us catch up? The request was so unexpected that I almost didn't know how to respond. For 10 years, family dinners had been exercises in polite avoidance, with conversations carefully steered away from my work. Now they wanted to dive deep into exactly what they'd been avoiding. I arrived at the Greenwich House to find them waiting with printed articles, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be a comprehensive research file. My father, ever the lawyer, had spent the week doing opposition research on his own son. We've been reading, he said without preamble, gesturing to the dining room table covered with documents. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Economics Today, Policy Review. Every article we could find that mentioned your work or quoted your analysis. My mother held up a magazine cover featuring a photo of President Morrison with the headline, "The President's Secret Economic Weapon." A smaller subtitle read, "How Treasury Analyst Jonathan Mitchell Became the Administration's Most Trusted Policy Architect." Secret weapon, she repeated, quietly. They called you a secret weapon, and we didn't even know you existed professionally. Marcus and Caroline arrived as we were settling into the living room, both carrying their own stacks of research materials. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept well in days. "Jonathan," he said, sitting heavily in the armchair across from me, "I spent Thursday night reading about the European banking crisis, the one that didn't happen because of the policies you designed. Do you know what would have occurred if that crisis had spread to American banks? Economic modeling suggested unemployment could have reached 12%. Housing values would have declined by 30 to 40% nationally, and we'd likely have experienced the longest recession since the 1930s. That's what I read. Millions of people would have lost their jobs, their homes, their life savings. And you prevented it. The administration prevented it." "I just provided the analysis." Caroline leaned forward, her expression intense. "Jonathan, stop minimizing what you did. We've been reading about the Oval Office briefings, the congressional testimony, the international negotiations. You didn't just provide analysis, you shaped policy that affected the entire global economy." I looked around the room at these people who'd known me since birth, watching them grapple with the disconnect between their perception and reality. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful to observe. My father cleared his throat, falling into his lawyer mode when emotions became overwhelming. "Son, help us understand the timeline. When did you transition from junior analyst to senior policymaker?" For the next 2 hours, I walked them through my career progression, the major crises I'd worked on, the policies I'd helped design. I explained how economic analysis worked, how policy recommendations moved through government channels, how international coordination prevented financial disasters,
They listened with the kind of focused attention they'd never given me before, asking detailed questions, taking notes, occasionally interrupting to request clarification on technical terms. The currency swap agreements with Japan, my mother said at one point, reading from a printout. This article says they prevented a liquidity crisis that could have affected Asian markets for decades. You negotiated those. I designed the framework and provided the economic justification. Ambassador Chen handled the actual diplomatic negotiations. But the substance came from you. Yes. My father set down his reading glasses and looked at me directly. Jonathan, I need to ask you something. And I want an honest answer. During all these years when we thought you were struggling, when we worried about your career prospects, when we were disappointed in your choices or you were aware of how significant your work was, it was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating for days. Yes, I said simply. I knew, and you never corrected our misunderstanding. I tried to, initially. But every time I mentioned briefing the Treasury Secretary or working on international policy, you'd dismiss it as government bureaucracy, or suggest I was exaggerating my role. After a while I realized you weren't interested in understanding what I actually did. You'd already decided that leaving the law firm was a failure, and nothing I said was going to change that perception. The silence that followed was heavy with years of missed connections and misunderstood conversations. Marcus broke it first. All those times I offered to help you find a real job. Jesus! Jonathan, you had the most important job any of us have ever heard of, and I was offering to get you interviews at investment banks. You were trying to help, I said. I understood that, but it must have been infuriating. Sometimes, mostly it was just sad. Caroline had been quietly flipping through pages of printed articles. There's something I don't understand, she said. If your work was this significant, why wasn't it more public? Why weren't you getting recognition, media attention, and public credit for these achievements? Because effective economic policy doesn't generate headlines, I explained. Prevention doesn't make news. When you successfully prevent a crisis, nothing dramatic happens. The markets remain stable. People keep their jobs. Families don't lose their homes. There's no visible story to report. But surely within government circles your colleagues knew your contributions. Of course. Secretary Harrison has been recommending me for increasingly senior positions for years. The president trusted my analysis enough to implement policies that affected hundreds of millions of people. But government recognition and public recognition are completely different things. My father was studying a Wall Street Journal article about the Treasury Secretary nomination. This reporter called you the administration's most influential unknown official. Unknown. How is it possible that someone in your position could be unknown? Because I preferred it that way. Public attention complicates policy work. When you become a public figure, everything becomes political. I was more effective working behind the scenes. Until now, my mother said quietly. Until now. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens that had been the backdrop for our childhood. I keep thinking about all the family gatherings, all the conversations where we treated you like you were the one who hadn't made anything of himself, and the whole time you were literally managing the American economy. Part of a team managing the American economy, I corrected again. Stop doing that, Caroline said sharply. Stop minimizing your role. We've spent the week reading about your work, and it's clear that you weren't just part of a team. You were often the person leading the analysis, making the recommendations, briefing the senior officials. She was right, of course. False modesty wasn't helping anyone process this new reality. Okay, I said. Yes, I've been one of the most influential economic policymakers in the federal government for the past 5 years. My analysis has shaped federal fiscal policy, international trade agreements, and crisis prevention strategies. Presidents have implemented my recommendations, and those policies have affected the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world. The words felt strange to say out loud to my family, after years of deflection and understatement. My father was quiet for several minutes. processing not just the information but the implications of what this meant about our family dynamics. "Son," he said finally, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the respect I should have shown from the beginning. You chose a path that required more courage, more intelligence, and more dedication than anything I ever did, and I was too arrogant to see it." "Dad." "No, let me finish. You could have come back to the law firm at any point. You could have leveraged your government experience into a lucrative private sector career. Instead, you stayed in public service, working for a fraction of what you could have earned elsewhere. Because you believed the work mattered more than the money. That's not failure. That's integrity." My mother reached over and took my hand, something she hadn't done since I was a child. "We're proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We should have said that years ago, but we're saying it now. We're proud of who you are and what you've accomplished." Marcus turned from the window. "The confirmation hearings start Monday?" "Yes. We'll be there. Front row. And when the senators ask about your qualifications, your character, your judgment, they're going to hear from people who've known you your entire life and can attest to your integrity. You don't have to." "Yes, we do. We have 10 years of not supporting you to make up for it." Judge Whitmore had been right. This was their opportunity to start over, to build a relationship based on who I actually was rather than who they'd assumed I was. The confirmation hearings would be grueling, the Treasury Secretary position would be demanding, and the public scrutiny would be intense. But for the first time in a decade, I wouldn't be facing any of it alone. My family finally understood who Jonathan Mitchell was, and they were ready to stand with him. The confirmation hearings lasted 3 days, and my family occupied the front row of the Senate Banking Committee chamber for every minute of them. I could see them during breaks between sessions. My father taking notes with the focused intensity he brought to important legal cases. My mother watching the proceedings with fierce protective attention. Marcus and Caroline whispering encouragement during the more challenging exchanges with hostile senators. Judge Whitmore had made good on his promise to make calls. Senator Catherine Walsh, the committee chair, opened the hearings by reading a letter of support from 12 federal judges, including 3 Supreme Court justices, attesting to my expertise in economic policy and my character. "Mr. Mitchell," Senator Walsh said during the opening session, "it's unusual for judicial officials to weigh in on executive branch nominations, but the committee has received unprecedented support for your confirmation from across the federal judiciary. Can you explain why judges would be interested in Treasury policy?" Senators, federal judges regularly handle cases involving bankruptcy, financial regulation, and economic disputes. They understand that sound economic policy creates the stable framework within which legal decisions can be made fairly and consistently. Judges appreciate policies that prevent crises rather than requiring them to sort out the consequences after systems fail. The questioning was thorough, but respectful. Senator after senator asked about specific policies I'd worked on, international agreements I'd helped negotiate, and crises I'd helped prevent. For 3 days, I explained complex economic mechanisms to legislators, defended policy decisions that had shaped the global economy, and outlined my vision for the Treasury's role in the administration. What struck me most wasn't the difficulty of the questions. I'd been preparing for this level of scrutiny my entire career, but the presence of my family. Every time I looked up during a particularly challenging exchange, I saw my father nodding approvingly at my responses, my mother watching with obvious pride, Marcus and Caroline hanging on every word. Senator James Crawford, the ranking Republican member, posed the toughest questions during the final session. "Mr. Mitchell, your critics argue that your behind-the-scenes approach to policymaking lacks transparency. How do we know that your recommendations serve the broader public interest rather than narrow administrative preferences?" Senator, transparency in economic policy requires balance. Markets can be destabilized by premature disclosure of potential problems or proposed solutions. However, every major policy I've recommended has been subject to extensive interagency review, congressional briefing, and international consultation. The test of whether policies serve the public interest isn't the publicity they receive, it's whether they work. And you believe your policies have worked. Senator, in the past decade, the United States has avoided 3 potential financial crises that could have triggered global recessions. Our international economic relationships are stronger than they've been in a generation. Federal fiscal policy is on a sustainable long-term trajectory for the first time in decades. Those outcomes didn't happen by accident. The committee voted 18-4 to confirm my nomination, with strong bipartisan support. The full Senate vote was scheduled for the following week, but Senator Walsh told reporters that confirmation was essentially assured. That evening, my family hosted a celebration dinner at the Greenwich Country Club, the same venue where I'd announced my intention to leave corporate law 15 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. To Treasury Secretary Jonathan Mitchell, my father said, raising his glass to a room filled with family friends, law firm partners, and community leaders who'd watched me grow up. A man who chose service over profit, principle over prestige, and proved that sometimes the most important work happens in places where people aren't looking. Judge Whitmore stood to add his own toast. I've had the privilege of watching Jonathan's career from an unusual perspective, first as someone who completely misunderstood what he was doing, then as someone who came to appreciate the sophistication and importance of his work. This nomination isn't just recognition of past achievements, it's an investment in America's economic future. But the moment that meant the most came later, when Marcus pulled me aside near the club's terrace. "Jonathan, I need to say something, and I need you to really hear it. I spent years thinking you'd wasted your potential, that you'd chosen an easy path because you couldn't handle the pressure of real success. I was wrong about everything. What you did, building a career based on competence and service, staying focused on work that mattered instead of work that paid, having the courage to be misunderstood for years while you quietly made the world better. That's the hardest thing anyone could do. And you did it with more grace than I would have had. Marcus, I'm not finished. I want my kids to grow up understanding what real success looks like. Not managing other people's money, not maximizing profits for wealthy clients, but using your abilities to serve something larger than yourself. I want them to be like their Uncle Jonathan." The full Senate vote was held the following Tuesday. I watched from the gallery as 87 senators voted to confirm my nomination, with only 13 opposing votes, the strongest bipartisan support for a Treasury Secretary in over 20 years. President Morrison administered the oath of office in the Rose Garden the next morning, with my family standing beside me as I swore to faithfully execute the duties of Secretary of the Treasury. "Jonathan," the president said afterward, as photographers captured the moment, "you've been preparing for this job your entire career, even when you didn't know it. The American people are fortunate to have someone with your expertise and judgment in this position." My first week as Treasury Secretary was a whirlwind of briefings, meetings with international finance ministers, and congressional consultations on pending economic legislation. But the real adjustment wasn't to the workload. I'd been handling similar responsibilities for years. It was to the visibility. Suddenly, my policy recommendations were front-page news. Economic analyses that had previously circulated only within government circles were being discussed on financial television programs. Reporters who'd never heard my name were writing profiles about my background and policy philosophy. The attention was overwhelming at first, but I gradually learned to use the platform effectively. In my first major speech as Treasury Secretary delivered to the National Association of Business Economists, I outlined a vision for economic policy that prioritized long-term stability over short-term political gains. Effective economic policy, I told the audience, requires the courage to address problems before they become crises, even when that means taking unpopular actions or explaining complex realities to people who prefer simple answers. Our job isn't to make people feel good about the economy, it's to ensure the economy actually works for all Americans. The speech was well received, but what mattered more to me was the call I received that evening from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my former supervisor who'd been promoted to Deputy Secretary. "Jonathan, I watched your speech today. You found your voice as a public official, the same analytical rigor, the same commitment to truth over politics, but now with the platform to actually change policy instead of just recommending it. 6 months into my tenure, I was invited to speak at Harvard Law School's graduation ceremony. Standing at the podium where I'd listened to my own commencement address 18 years earlier, I looked out at young lawyers about to begin their careers and tried to articulate what I'd learned about success, failure, and the courage to choose your own path. Some of you will go to prestigious law firms, earn substantial salaries, and build careers that look successful by conventional measures, I told them. Others will choose public service, nonprofit work, or advocacy roles that pay less but serve larger purposes. Both paths have value, but only one will be right for you. The question isn't whether you'll face criticism for your choices. You will. The question is whether you'll have the courage to choose work that uses your abilities in service of something you believe in, even when that work is misunderstood or undervalued by people whose opinions you care about. After the ceremony, the dean of Harvard Law School introduced me to current students interested in public service careers. One young woman, a second-year student named Sarah Chen, asked about the transition from private practice to government work. "Professor, were you ever tempted to go back to corporate law when your family didn't understand what you were doing?" "Every day," I answered honestly, "but I learned something important. You can spend your life trying to become the person other people want you to be, or you can become the person you're meant to be and trust that the right people will eventually understand. The second path is harder, but it's the only one that leads to genuine satisfaction." That evening, I called my parents from my office in the Treasury building, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the dark sky. "How was Harvard?" my mother asked. "Good. Meaningful. I think I helped some young people understand that public service is a viable career path." "Jonathan," my father said, and I could hear the pride in his voice, "your mother and I have been talking. We want you to know that we understand now what we couldn't see before. You didn't fail when you left the law firm. You succeeded in finding work that made you who you were supposed to be." "Thank you, Dad. That means everything." "We love you, son. And we're proud of the Treasury Secretary. But we're even prouder of the man who became Treasury Secretary by never compromising his principles." Later that night, alone in my office, I pulled out a framed photo that had been sitting in my desk drawer for years, a picture from my law school graduation, with my parents beaming on either side of me. For so long, that photo had represented expectations I'd failed to meet, a path I'd abandoned, a younger version of myself who'd been destined for disappointment. Now I placed it on my desk, next to the official Treasury Secretary seal, and saw it differently. That young man in the graduation photo hadn't failed. He'd just taken a longer, more difficult route to become exactly who he was meant to be. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that nobody sees coming, including the person taking them. Sometimes success looks like failure until the moment it doesn't, and sometimes the greatest achievement is having the courage to build a life based on service rather than recognition, principle rather than profit, and competence rather than appearance. I'd spent 15 years being misunderstood by the people whose opinions mattered most to me. But I'd also spent those 15 years becoming someone worth understanding. And now, finally, I was both. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.